Paul Lehrman is a musician, composer, educator, filmmaker, music technologist, the author of several books, including the Insider Audio Bathroom Reader, and was a columnist at Mix magazine for over a decade. He currently teaches at Tufts University as the head of the music engineering program. Paul was in New York City for the AES convention in 2019 and stopped by Sear Sound to talk with John and Stewart about his career in the music industry, both as a writer and in studios. Paul shares his deep knowledge of MIDI, the history of electronic instruments and music, playing the bassoon, and orchestrating performances of the near-lost 1924 electronic composition Le Ballet Mecanique. Flowing throughout Paul's interview is a profound sense of the absurd, which springs from his love of the humor of the Marx Brothers, Tom Lehrer, and the Firesign Theater.
So, welcome, Paul.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming down from Boston.
You. Nice to be here.
Great to have you.
Tony got us copies of the books. The book.
Oh, you have the other copies.
Okay, good. The joke chapter was very good. The one joke I asked you about, which I didn't notice, but I didn't finish the chapter, was what's the difference between a banjo and an onion?
Nobody cries when you cut up a banjo. there's so many in there, and I got them from so many different sources. I don't even remember them.
Yeah. How did you source them? Just asking people?
Well, no, there was an internet in those days. This was like 2007. I think I was putting the book together, and I just went on the web. There was a wonderful series of jokes that MIT put up. Techie jokes. Mm-hmm. And so I stole from that. And people would tell me stuff. Yeah. I mean, Valerie Gent is this wonderful singer, and she told me it's one of the classics. And then one of my fellow faculty members, when I was teaching at the Bowl, told me the one about, the guy who comes out with piss dripping out of his fly, and he's a piano player, and he names all of his tunes after, these horrible, obscene names. And someone says, "Hey, buddy, you're coming out of the bathroom and there's pee all over your shoes." He goes, "Know it? I wrote it." I mean, that's
Can
a
you
classic.
sing me a few lines?
The book, if I may plug the book, which I can't because it's not available anymore, the Insider Audio Bathroom Reader.
So where did Tony get them from?
Oh, no, he bought it when it came out.
He stockpiled them?
He stockpiled them. He bought like 10 of them.
Fucking lunatic.
Wow.
Like he bought them all.
My brother.
So they're not in publication?
No, they not only did they pull it from publication after like 2 years, but they destroyed all the copies. They said they couldn't find me. I've been living in the same place for 30 years, and they said they couldn't find me. And so they destroyed all the copies. So, I see it online on eBay or Amazon used for like $35.
Right.
Wow. I've got 3 or 4 copies myself. Mm-hmm.
Can you reprint? Are you allowed to?
I do. I got the ebook rights from the publisher, so I could do that.
So for our listeners, if they want to pick up a copy, they just contact you?
Well, I haven't done it yet.
Right.
So...
or they contact Tony.
Exactly.
Tony's got all the stock.
He charged me $75. I don't have $100 for the book. The Inside Audio Bathroom Reader.
Right.
Right, except we were commenting at it.
Yeah.
You'd have to go to the bathroom.
Like I do.
Like he does. An hour at a time.
It depends. It could take you 2 weeks, could take you 2 days. It depends on your habits. Yeah. But the idea being it's a bunch of short essays. It's stuff that I wrote for Mix magazine when I was writing a column for Mix. So I pulled out all these columns, the ones that I liked, and I threw in a couple that they wouldn't let me print. And then every 5 chapters, there's like 2 or 3 pages of jokes. Right. And it's all about music, and it's all about computers, and it's all about audio. The one about the guy who goes into the studio and says, all right, you ready? Okay. I hate this entire business. You guys have been fucking me over my entire life, and I can't stand it, and that's the end of it. And he pulls out a revolver and blows his head off, and the engineer says, okay, I got that one. You want to do a take?
Oh, my God. So I was talking to Stewart earlier about Mix magazine from my remembering as a younger man. And I just remember, and we both said the same thing. We said that we kind of lived for that part of the month when the magazine came out. Yeah. Like it was so vital.
What day it was. We'd go and get the fresh copy.
Pre-internet. And we hung on like every fucking page. Yeah. It was such a great magazine. And also every
studio.
Yeah.
You walked, there was always copies in the studio.
Yeah. Well, it was a good magazine. I mean, there was another magazine that was out well, there were two other magazines that were out in the 70s and early 80s. There was DB,
Right.
and which was Larry Zide, and there was recording engineer producer,
Right.
which I used to write for as well. And I wrote for them before I wrote for Mix. And that was when I was writing for them. It was Mel Lambert was the editor at REP. And that was a wonderful magazine. That was more serious.
Yeah.
than
And there
Mix.
was a musician magazine that was later.
There was Musician magazine, which was more of a pop magazine. You know, it had some techie stuff in it, but it was more geared not necessarily towards musicians, but towards musical lovers. That was out of Gloucester, Mass.
Right.
Yeah, I actually did some writing for them too. But after recording engineer producer folded, David Schwartz, who was the publisher of Mix, came to me and said, we're retiring Ken Pullman, who had been doing this insider audio column for a long time. And, I mean, Ken's brilliant. You know, he's a great writer, great, technical writer. And they said they wanted to take it in a different direction. How many times have we heard that, right? They wanted to do something which wasn't quite as serious and wasn't quite as technical, and they thought I could be more of a generalist.
Right.
So I took it on, and I did it for 12 years.
Wow.
And there were people who told me that, they picked it up, they read St. Croix, they read me, and then they put it down,
Right.
Did you come to it from a writing background or a musical background?
I came to it from a music background. I never formally studied writing, but I started doing journalism in the late 70s. I used to write for a paper called the Boston Phoenix, which was an alternative weekly paper in Boston. It's sort of where I got my training. It was a really, really well-written paper. It was all these young people who have since, gone on to big magazines, the New Yorker, the Boston Globe, the New York Times, the Washington Post. They've won Pulitzer Prizes. I mean, it was a really amazing training ground for young writers. And I was doing stuff on audio and music and tech in general. So I wrote one of the first articles in the popular press about cellular phones, explaining cell phones to the general public. And I would write things about subscription television. Remember subscription television?
Yeah.
And because Boston was very late to come to cable. And I actually did a political piece about why Boston was very late to come to cable. And, there were all sorts of internecine fights going on between the mayor and mayors of surrounding cities and city councils and stuff. Now we got cable.
Right.
But Boston was one of the last big cities to be cabled. And so that was where I got my training, was writing for them.
But your musical background?
Musical background, I have a degree as a classical bassoon player.
Wow.
And I've been playing music.
There's no joke in the book
Yeah,
about
there's got to
that?
be 17 jokes about that.
Oh, there's got to be a bassoon joke in there somewhere.
Yeah.
We'll write one by the end of this.
Right. I can modify a joke for a bassoon. What's the difference between an oboe and a bassoon is that the bassoon burns longer. That's
what a bassoon player uses for birth control?
His face?
His personality.
And then there's another joke. Another one. What do you call a beautiful woman on a bassoon player's arm?
Oh, tattoo.
Yeah, we read that one.
I read that one.
So
just apply all of them to bassoon.
well, that's it. And I have a whole section of jokes that are general purpose. Instrumental jokes. Trombones, French horns, tubas. Whatever, perfect pitch. It's when you throw the tube into the toilet without hitting the rim. That sort of. Anyway, so how I got into professional audio journalism is really an interesting story. I got hired through a friend of Harry Hirsch, whom I was hucking.
Sure.
I was hucking Harry for a couple of years about getting a job at one of his studios. And I guess I met him when he had first started sound mixers. He had just left Media Sound and was starting sound mixers, and I was hanging around and trying to get a job as a recording engineer, or just an assistant. And I didn't really know much about the business. I was hanging around with him. I was hanging around with Bruce Staple. If you remember Bruce from Electric Lady.
I don't remember.
Bruce actually hired me to be a maintenance engineer at Electric Lady.
Wow.
And I said, I don't want to be a maintenance engineer, because that's one of those things, it's not like being a tape op where you end up, moving up when somebody's sick and can't do the session. If you're a maintenance engineer, you got a soldering iron up your nose. The entire.
Yeah, like Paul Prestopino is a perfect example.
Right.
He did that job for like 50 years or 40 years.
Right. And I knew I didn't want to go that way, so I didn't take that job. But Harry was approached by a guy in Trinidad, of all places, an American filmmaker who was trying to build a media empire in Trinidad. And I won't mention the guy's name. He's dead now, but he was a crook. Right. And I'm sure Harry didn't know this, but he was basically starting up a film company, a record company, and a recording studio. He had a John Storick design studio. It was supplied by Ambrosius. It was all MCI, and it was kind of a disaster. And in Trinidad, they don't know from ventilation, right? They didn't know that when you put 24 Dolby A units in a box, you got to have a hole in it somewhere, right? So the Dolbys were, failing left and right.
Right.
There was a story where Carnival was the big holiday there. It's like Mardi Gras. And I woke up Carnival morning, and my boss had driven up to my house. He said, "We got to go to the studio." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "You just got to come with me." So we drove up to the studio, which was about a half an hour away on top of this mountain. And there was a hole in the roof, big hole in the roof right above the control room, and the whole rug is flooded. Unfortunately, the equipment wasn't harmed too bad, but there's this hole in the roof because it had rained that night. So we go find the contractor. We go up on the roof, and we discover that there's the guys who were working on the roof, and they had a tarp, which they were supposed to put over the hole in the roof, and they didn't bother. It was sitting folded up next to the hole. So we went to the guy's house, and we said, "Why did you do this?" He said, "Well, because it's Carnival." And we said, what the hell does Carnival have to do with not covering up the hole? He says, "Carnival's during the dry season." So that was my first story.
Yeah. Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, right. It's during the dry, and then there was the other one about, why we never had telephone service, because we were up on top of a mountain. There was this long winding road with telephone wires going up there. Carnival is all about costumes. It's all about these huge things, right? What are they used to make these huge things? Copper wire. Where do you get copper wire if you don't have any money? You go to an isolated country road and you cut the telephone line, and that's why we never had telephone service. So it was that those sort of stories went on and on and on. I only lasted there like 8 months.
Didn't he start Center for Media Arts? The school?
Yes, he did.
That was like one of the first.
Yes, and I remember writing an article about that.
It was the first kind of like
school that was dedicated to recording. So the way I started writing for professional audio magazines was those stories. I sold them to Studio Sound magazine. Studio Sound magazine had a little column called Agony, in which they would write, in which they would print these, these little disaster stories. Right. And those are the first pieces I sold in a professional audio press. And then I got to be a regular at Studio Sound. As a matter of fact, I wrote about Sear Sound, which at the time was the last all-tube studio in New York.
What year was that?
1983.
Nice.
And it's in the July 83 issue of Studio Sound. If anyone's got a copy hanging around, you can check it out.
Mitch Easter, the famous producer down in North Carolina, has all those magazines saved in his studio, recording studio, the Fidelatorium. He has an engineer, producer. What was it? Recording engineer? What was that one?
Recording engineer, producer.
Yeah, he has all of those. It's so much fun, and they're just everywhere.
And it's wonderful. It's wonderful to look at the ads and see, what people were promising.
Yeah.
Did we have the conversation online about the Publison Infernal Machine? Was that our conversation? I was having a conversation with somebody online about fame.
Alex Case.
Alex, right? That's right. It was Alex. Okay. Yeah. And David Bowie, right? The fame. And how did he do that? And all these people were saying, "Well, they did it with this, with this, with this." And I knew that it was the Publison Infernal Machine because they had an ad which talked about that. David Bowie's famous signal.
Fake news. I think it was an eventide.
No.
But the Infernal Machine was the Infernal Machine. It was I could never figure out how to use that fucking thing.
It was ridiculous.
Yeah.
And the guy who used to present it at AES is this little French guy, and he would talk incredibly fast, and you couldn't understand anything that he was saying.
So how do you know Tony?
How do I know Tony? I know Tony mostly through Laurie Spiegel. Laurie's been a very dear friend for many years, and Laurie has a party every year at AES. Right. And that's how I met Richard, and that's how I met Tony. And we discovered we were all Firesign Theater freaks. We were all Tom Lehrer freaks. We get. I mean, the last party, 2 years ago, we got in the cab, going back up to Port Authority or wherever we were going, because Laurie's way down by the World Trade Center. Yeah. And, we just started singing Tom Lehrer songs. I don't know what the driver thought.
Thought there's a bunch of fucking hippies in my car.
Old hippies, a bunch of old hippies.
Right?
There are no young hippies.
I had breakfast with another friend from high school who was a real Firesign Theater freak. And I lived that stuff in high school. I saw them perform a couple of times. And people ask me, where do you get your sense of humor from? I said, well, it's one part my father, one part Lehrer, one part Firesign Theater, and one part the Marx Brothers. And, that's
pretty good. I'd never met your father, but I can only assume.
Well, my father is like 3 parts Marx Brothers, so it works out, So it's a little bit more concentrated that way.
So then... That was a sidebar, but so you're at Mix then. You're doing insider audio there.
Right. That started in 1996.
Right.
So I was already pretty well established. I'd written a book on MIDI, which was a fairly big deal, MIDI for the professional, which AMSCO put out, music sales, and that sold really well. That was in print for something like 22 years.
Wow.
Which is, amazing for, a tech book.
Right.
I mean, a whole lot of it was out of date by the end of 10 years, but there was still enough in there. And since then, I've, taken out like 3 chapters, and I just publish it as a PDF, and I give it out to my students.
Teach?
I teach at Tufts University, which is outside of Boston.
Great.
Medford, Massachusetts.
And what is there a name of the class?
Well, there's a program. It's a minor program called music engineering. And it's something that I basically started with a colleague who is in the mechanical engineering department. I was hired in 2000 to teach computer music because they didn't have anything. Tufts was a very old-fashioned liberal arts music department. They had musicology, they had an excellent ethnomusicology program, they had a theory program, they had a composition program, but no tech at all. And I used to say to them when they brought me in 2000, I was bringing the music department kicking and screaming into the 80s. So we set up a lab in the computer science building because there was actually no music building at Tufts. Right. Everybody was sort of spread out among these different other buildings. And it just started to build up. And after the first year, they asked me to teach a course in electronic musical instrument design, about which I knew nothing, but I was the one-eyed man in the kingdom of the blind, and so I started teaching this course. The first couple of years, it was kind of a disaster, but then I started to learn stuff, and it got better. And so now I teach a course in recording and production. I teach a course in basic computer music, which is, sequencing and sampling and synthesis. I teach this course in electronic musical instrument design, and I started most recently teaching a course in the history of electronic music from 1890 to 1980. Everyone says, 1890? What was there in 1890? Well, there was some interesting stuff going on in 1890.
Like what?
Go ahead.
Well, there was an instrument called the telharmonium, and the telharmonium was like a giant Hammond organ, if you can imagine a Hammond organ that has no amplifier stages. So it was basically built out of, I don't know how many hundred generators. And you hit a key and the generator spun around, and then it was broadcast over telephone lines, and you had to subscribe to it. So it was right in Midtown Manhattan, and Telharmonic Hall was they called it. It was this gigantic instrument. It was like 3 huge warehouse rooms, and they sold subscriptions. So you'd pick up your telephone and you'd hear somebody playing Foray or Stars and Stripes Forever or something like that. It was all live programming,
right?
And it wasn't the first electronic instrument, but it was certainly the first reasonably well known electronic instrument.
Right.
And
are there any documents of what it sounded like?
No.
Right.
Unfortunately,
it doesn't exist.
Doesn't exist. They went out of business around 1910, so there's no recordings.
Wow.
Terrible. And then when Lawrence Hammond came out with the Hammond organ, the guy who built this thing, his name was Thaddeus Cahill. His grandchildren wanted to sue Hammond.
Wow.
Because the idea was really similar.
Right.
Only instead of having this room-sized thing, you had these little tone wheels and amplifiers. Oh, we have triodes now. We can do this. And Cahill was still alive, and he just didn't want to. He didn't want to get involved. He didn't want to mess with it.
Right.
But it really is the same design. It was just incredibly impractical. I mean, talk about the worst business plan in the world. Was this the telharmonium? But everybody knows about the theremin, and there's another instrument that Leon Theremin made in 1930 called the rhythmicon, which nobody knows anything about.
Yeah, what is that?
The rhythmicon is sort of a polyphonic, polymetric metronome. It can play 16 notes, 16 rhythms simultaneously. And the rhythms are all harmonically related to each other. So you've got a fundamental pulse, and then you've got the second, you've got 2 times the pulse, 3 times the pulse, 4 times the pulse, 5 times the pulse, 6 times the pulse. Then it starts getting weird. 7 times the pulse, 9 times the pulse,
so
11 times the pulse.
It's not the harmonic, it's not 1/5 octave, third.
No. Well, it is, but it keeps going. Because within the first 16 harmonics, there's a lot of strange stuff.
Right.
It's not like 2nd, 4th, 8th, and 16th. Right. It gets weird. You get into microtones. So each note is harmonically related to each other note, and each rhythm is harmonically related to each other rhythm. And it's this chaotic thing. It sounds great when it's going at full blast, and it's got a little keyboard. When you hit the keyboard, and it tells you, which harmonic you want to play. And there were only 3 of these instruments built. And one of them is in the Smithsonian. It doesn't work. One of them was destroyed. It was given to Stanford, and they destroyed it. And one of them's in Moscow at a museum at the Moscow Conservatory. And now here comes Laurie Spiegel again, okay? A friend of mine in Holland, whom I do a lot of work with on George Antheil, which we'll talk about at some point, I'm sure, is a real nut about ancient instruments. And he and I have been trying to track down rhythmicons for a few years. And I do an ensemble. I do an electronic ensemble at Tufts. And one of the pieces I wanted to do was a piece that was written by Henry Cowell for rhythmicon and orchestra. It's the only existing piece that was ever written for rhythmicon. And I decided I would do a computer simulation of a rhythmicon. So I put one together in Reason, and, I thought it sounded pretty good. So last year, there was a Laurie Spiegel party, and who should show up but Gautier, the pop star.
Oh, cool.
And I knew that he was into ancient electronic instruments because he was fooling around with andiolines and, some stuff like that. He said I was an andioline orchestra. I'd met him the year before at Laurie's. So we're at this party, and I said to him, I wasn't actually there. I was sick, so I couldn't come down for AES, so I Skyped my way into the party. So they're passing me around on an iPad, right? And I'm talking to her. So I get to Gautier and I say, hey, you'll appreciate this. I am going to do Henry Cowell's Rhythmicana for Rhythmicon and Orchestra. And he said, you want to use mine?
He has one?
He had built one.
Built one.
Himself. He sent an engineer by the name of Mike Buffington
to
Moscow, where they gave him permission to take the thing back to his hotel room. And he spent 4 days without sleeping, taking it apart, measuring everything, checking out all the components.
Wow.
Put it back together and reverse engineered it. And came back here, found this instrument was built in the 1960s. The other were built in the 1930s. And he found all the parts. There was a French film projector, which was the frame. There was a German turntable, which was the main motor.
Crazy.
And, and these giant capacitors and these Soviet tubes.
So what does it sound like?
It's not a pleasant sounding instrument.
I mean, you could just do that. You don't even need it.
That's right. No, you could sample me.
You sound fine.
And it would be
We just did.
I just reverse engineered Paul.
Right. That's right. Yeah, so Mike Buffington, this engineer, built one for Gautier. Now he's built a second one, which is MIDI controllable. And we ended up using that in the performance, a MIDI rhythmicon. So that was fun.
Do you still play?
I do, and this just this last year, I've been sort of studying jazz piano.
Oh wow!
Nice.
There was one point when I was in high school where I counted up the number of instruments I played, and it was 11. Because I was a woodwind player, so I played all the woodwinds, and I was a percussionist, and I played piano, and I played guitar, and I played bass. I still play piano. I still play a little guitar. I still play bass. Don't play bassoon anymore. Although I was suckered into it at Tufts a few years ago when the band director said, you used to play bassoon, huh? And I said, yeah, but, I haven't touched it in 30 years and I don't have a reed. And he said, well, we really need a bassoon player. I've got this good bassoon. I said, no. And he said, well, we're going to Costa Rica for winter break. You want to come? I said, let me get a reed.
Is that something that it's hard to pick back up?
Terrible.
The embouchure?
The embouchure. It's all about the embouture. The fingers came back right away.
Right.
But
What's the embouchure?
You put the reed in your mouth and you go...
Yep.
Oh, right.
And the reed's got to be just right. I mean, the reed, somebody expresses it. I actually took some lessons at the time, too. The reed is the instrument.
It's a double reed.
It's a double reed. Yeah. It's like an oboe.
Is that specific for bassoon?
For both those two instruments?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, oboe, bassoon, English horn, contrabassoon. They're double reed instruments. And the reed makes the sound. Mm-hmm. And the sound goes... I mean, that's what a bassoon reed sounds like. And you crow it, and you scrape it, and you put wires around it, and all this stuff. And you make your own reeds. You can't buy a bassoon reed that's going to suit you. So you make them, or your teacher makes them.
Wow.
And the guy I was studying with this time around, when I took a few lessons, you go into his house, and there's hundreds of them all over the place, all over the kitchen. He's making like 5 a day.
Wow.
And you want to get that one reed that really sounds good, and then you want to have a second reed in case the first one craps out, and then you want to have a third reed. And I used to have dreams when I was studying bassoon in college. I would have dreams about getting up on stage and playing in an orchestra and my reed cracks. And when I started playing again to go to Costa Rica, I started having the dreams again. And I said, ooh, I don't think I want to do this for very long. But it was fun. It's a wonderful instrument. It's very physical, and it really
Beautiful
resonates
sound.
the body. Yeah. You play those low notes, and it just really goes right through you.
Do you play oboe as well?
I don't. I played a little bit. My first, so long as we're off on sidebars, my first job, and actually, I think I wrote this up in the book. My first job out of college was working for Sam Ash Music. It was one of their store, which was out on the island in Hempstead.
Right. That's where they originated, right?
Well, they originated in Brooklyn. But Hempstead was like their second store, and that was the mothership.
Right.
So I was working there, and I was selling sheet music. I wasn't even in the back. I wasn't selling guitars and amps and drums where all the fancy stuff was. But then again, I didn't have to deal with all the kids coming in and playing Stairway to Heaven.
Right.
But so I was in the front selling sheet music and guitar strings and reeds and stuff like that. And there was this plastic oboe that was sitting on a shelf for God knows how many years. It was covered with dust. It was a Bundy plastic oboe. And the boss came and said, okay, whoever sells this gets a $10 spiff. All right, and I was making $90 a week, so $10 was, pretty decent money. So I took it home, and I took home a reed, because we were selling oboe reeds, and I learned how to play a few scales on it. And lo and behold, a couple of weeks later, some mother comes in, and she says, oh, my son's been playing the oboe at school, and it's not very good. We want a real oboe. So I sold her this Bundy plastic oboe, which didn't even have keys on the lower two holes, because you don't use those notes very much, so to cut back 82 cents in the manufacturing cost or whatever, they didn't include those keys. So I sold her this plastic oboe, and and everybody came up to me afterwards and said, wow,
you got the $10
that was brilliant. I got the $10 and I went out in the parking lot and I threw up. And, and I didn't last in that job too much longer either. I was very good at it, obviously, but, I just didn't want to do that kind of stuff.
And so from being a classical bassoonist into sort of, not that it's necessarily the pop world, but
I was always into pop music.
So you
and I was always playing in rock and roll bands.
Right.
I started in rock and roll bands when I was like 10.
Right.
And as a matter of fact, I had a music teacher in junior high school who put together a Beatles band so that we could do a Beatles medley in junior high school chorus. And I played rhythm guitar.
Right.
And that was the first time I had played, with a real band and real amplifiers and stuff like that. And I was like, oh man, this is it, man. But I have an older brother who's a musician, and he and I used to play duets when we were kids. He'd play guitar, he'd play ukulele, I'd play guitar. We'd sing Tom Lehrer songs, and I didn't know what they meant, but we'd sing them.
Right.
And so I was always playing. And then, the Beatles came out, and I was like, this is what I want to do.
Yeah.
This is what I want to do. And I got really into the Blues Project. I said, ooh, that's what I want to do. Danny Cowell, Bal Cooper, this is what I want to do. And so I played in bands all through high school and college.
And how did you get into the studio world?
I always loved recording. I got my father to buy me a tape recorder when I was like a sophomore in high school. And I would just
remember what it was?
The Revox or a portable?
It was a Sony 350. 3 heads.
Oh, wow.
Sound on sound, 2 speeds, good low impedance inputs. I still have it. I mean, it hasn't worked for 50 years, but I still have it. It was a really, really nice deck. Yeah. And then my brother also had a tape recorder, so we would do, bounce sound on sound.
That's great.
And we'd experiment. I'd also built a theremin when I was 12 from a kit.
Wow.
Really?
Which didn't work very well. But
you built it.
But I built it, and it made noises, And so I would record that. And I had gotten into electronic music when I was very young. And I guess I was just beginning high school. And my brother would come home from college with these records, and I'd listen to the records and say, "Wow!"
Like Switched on Bach or any of that?
No, the heavy duty stuff, Stockhausen and Luciano Berio and Ilan Miraglu and people like that, the Columbia Princeton guys. And I said, wow, I want to do that. Yeah, when Switched on Bach came out, I hated it.
Wow.
I said, this isn't electronic music.
Pop version.
This is pop music.
Right.
And
that's like me with Rush. When I meet all these kids that like Rush, I'm like, that's fake prog rock.
Right,
That's not real.
Right. So anyway, Wendy Carlos and I are now friends, but for a long time we didn't talk to each other.
Right.
And but I was always into that side of things. And when I was in college, I I went to Columbia for 2 years to study electronic music, and then I dropped out for various reasons. And I ended up going to a school which had just opened called SUNY Purchase.
Yeah.
And it had a good conservatory there, but it was really small. It literally had just opened. I was in the first graduating class in music, and I was the resident recording engineer.
Oh, wow.
Cool.
So that must have been like 78?
75.
75.
I graduated in 75. It was a cool place. I really, really enjoyed it because it was small and nobody, quite knew what they was doing. But the faculty was just top notch. I mean, really
People from New York, artists from New York.
Yeah, artists from New York. All the people. I don't know if you know the group Speculum Musicae. They were a new music group.
Yeah.
All the players from there. My teacher was Donald McCourt, who was like the most successful freelance bassoonist in New York. Great, great guy. He later became dean. Robert Levin. Was the theory teacher. It was a really fabulous
But all the other
faculty.
departments were great too. The art department,
Yes,
photography.
John Cohen.
John Cohen.
How do you know these guys?
R.I.P.
Well, John.
He taught art.
He taught there, but he was also Lost City Ramblers.
Ramblers, right?
Oh, cool.
I've actually I knew him a little bit. Really great guy.
And the other thing I was doing at Purchase was not only was I the recording engineer for the music department, but I would do live sound for all the groups that came in. So I got to do live sound for Elvin Jones
Nice.
and for David Bromberg Big Band.
Awesome.
And who else? Well, a lot of solo acts, obviously. Steve Goodman, Oregon.
Oh, I remember that.
I got to assist. I didn't do the whole mix, but I assisted on that. So whenever there was any kind of event on campus, I was the guy. I designed the sound system and bought it and got paid for it. I was working for an outfit called K&L Sound. Does that ring a bell?
No.
Doesn't for me.
They were out of Boston,
That's why.
and they were wholesalers.
Right.
And these two guys, Ken and Louie, they had campus reps all over the country. And they'd send you these price lists, which were these handwritten Xerox price lists, and you could sell hi-fi stuff to your fellow students at really, really good prices, and then you'd make, like 10% markup or whatever on anything you sold. So I got involved in this, and I ended up outfitting the campus sound system. I ended up outfitting the campus radio station. I made a lot of money doing this,
Good deal.
And that was part of what got me into the pro sound, because all of a sudden I had to design this stuff.
Right.
And I didn't really know what I was doing, so I had to learn it all. We had those little Shure inline mixers.
Right.
Yeah.
We had a lot of those, and the whole radio station, we equipped. We got a LPB was the company that did campus broadcast equipment at the time, so we got all that.
And you had the Capitol Theater up there to go to see nice
Capitol
concerts.
Theater, Portchester, went and saw the Dead there a few times. Went and saw the Dead the night that they stopped the concert because somebody phoned in a bomb threat.
Oh, wow.
That was a fairly famous concert.
That was at the Capitol Theater?
That was at the Capitol,
Wow.
yeah.
It's amazing. I never saw the Dead, I don't think.
Oh,
Maybe I did.
God.
I went through my concert ticket stubs with my niece the other day,
Really?
last week, and I've been telling people that I've never seen The Clash or Led
You
Zeppelin.
kept all your stubs.
I have all my stubs. And it turns out I saw Led Zeppelin and The Clash.
You were
Different place, I just don't remember. I don't even know how that. I've been saying for you, I wish I could have seen Led Zeppelin. I missed that one. Really missed that. I was fucking there, idiot.
Well, I managed to see a lot of bands. The one band that I regret not seeing earlier was The Who.
Right.
That I saw them the week after Entwistle died.
Right. Right.
I had the tickets, obviously, and that was. I felt bad about that.
Yeah.
But there was a period of time. I counted this up not too long ago. There was a period of time where there were all these live albums that came out.
Yeah.
I was at all of those.
That's amazing.
Allman Brothers at Fillmore East. I was at that.
Yeah.
They were the opening band for the Dead.
Right.
You went to that show.
I went. Well, there was
was a
three
couple of them,
shows.
right.
But I was at one of them.
That's pretty much the greatest live
That's
record ever.
amazing.
Well, all those records were great because another sidebar story is a friend of mine, Billy Burrs, just turned 50. So for my 60th birthday, he gave me the Dylan box set from the movie, which is like
cool.
16 CDs of those shows.
Right.
So my thought with him was I was going to go back and find all those great records, Humble Pie, your Allman Brothers, you were talking about Little Feet Live.
Band
I can
Rock
name
of
like
Ages.
7.
I was at that concert too.
Yeah.
New
Right.
Year's Eve.
New Year's Eve, Bob Dylan.
Yeah.
That was you.
Dylan showed up.
Lehrman.
But the point was I went
so
online
funny.
to buy them.
There's
That was
my
amazing.
friend Jimmy, right at the beginning
Nobody
of
cares
the
about me.
record. We'll get back to you in a minute. right at the beginning of the record.
When you guys get a room.
When you
you're in a room.
when you put on Rock of Ages, you hear this. Yow!
That's your
That's
buddy.
my friend Jimmy.
No, really?
Yeah.
I went with my cousin Dan, who, like, about 11:30, he was with his girlfriend, said to me, "Hey, I'm gonna go with her, like to whatever."
So he went off to get laid and he missed.
And the next morning I fucking called him up. Dude, you idiot. Bob Dylan walks out a half an hour later.
Yeah.
So, but really quick, so I went online to buy these records and they're all been remastered, even on vinyl.
Right.
And I just had no confidence that they might sound like I remember the original sounding. Mm-hmm. So I didn't do it. You know what I mean? But like there's a new version of Humble Pie remixed and remastered. All of them. I can't find the original records, which I think is, a bummer in a way.
Yeah, really. Really. Be interested to hear what they sound like.
Yeah, I didn't want to take the chance on the birthday gift of them not being
you were
around.
looking for vinyl?
Yeah, I was looking for vinyl. I thought it would be really great to get them the 8 great live records from the 70s.
Right.
Like there's 8 of them. I counted them.
Frampton?
Yeah, Frampton was one of them for sure. But Humble Pie for sure. I mean, I loved rocking the Fillmore Humble Pie record. I went through 2 copies and growing up. Like I wore the first vinyl
You just see
out.
through the first one.
Yeah.
Zappa was Zappa at the Fillmore one?
Maybe
Oh,
that was
God,
one,
yes,
yeah.
Live at the Fillmore East.
Live at the Fillmore East with Happy
Flo,
Together.
With Flo and Eddie, right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Wow.
Here comes my bullet. I wasn't at that one, but I was at a different Flo and Eddie concert. I think it was just before. And the Youngbloods did a concert at the Fillmore series of concerts, which ended up being an album, Ride the Wind.
Oh, right.
Which was their live album. And they were opening for Jefferson Airplane. And I remember going to see them. I was a huge Airplane freak. And I remember going to see the Youngbloods. I think I was probably doing psilocybin that night. And I went to see them. And the Youngbloods were so amazing. That, like,
Jesse Colin Young.
Nobody wanted to see the Airplane after that. It was like everybody was so... just so mellowed out. And then the Airplane came on and Volunteers had just come out.
Right.
And they just started crashing into that. And it was like, okay, this is going to be a little different.
Yeah.
It was an amazing concert.
What was the Youngblood song?
Ride the Wind.
Well, get together.
Yeah, come on, people now. Right.
Stupid. Overdone song.
Yeah.
But they had some beautiful stuff. Ride the Wind. And,
Smell the Glove.
No, that wasn't that.
No, different band.
Different band.
Beat the Needles.
Right.
Wait. I mean, sorry.
You ever hear the record The Ruddles?
Yes, I have that on 8-track. Yeah, I do. I swear to God. Sealed. Yeah, I do.
Still have it?
Something.
I have it. I found all my 8-tracks too, like about 3 months ago. So what were we talking about? We were talking about the concerts, but you were doing live sound. That's what you were saying. You were doing.
I was doing live sound for all these guys at Purchase, and so that's how I got into the studio stuff. And then after I got out of college, what I wanted to be a recording producer or an engineer, or I wanted to be I wanted to produce classical records. Mm-hmm. That's really what I wanted to do. And I went around to all the classical labels, and they all said, classical music is dying. We don't hire people, set up your own engineering firm, get your own stuff, get a Crown tape recorder and, a bunch of Neumanns, and, maybe we'll hire you for stuff. And, I didn't have that kind of capital. So, I ended up doing radio. I was doing radio engineering for a couple of years. Did a year.
Did you come back to New York?
I was still in New York.
Right.
I hadn't left New York yet. I was engineer for WNCN, the classical station here. So I did most of their live recordings, and I didn't like the job very much. And then I got fired. And it's a long story. It turns out they didn't need me anymore. Mm-hmm. I wasn't fired for malfeasance. I was fired because they didn't need me.
Yeah.
And then I got hired by a station in Boston, WCRB, which was a classical station up there, and they hired me as chief engineer. And I was seriously unqualified for this job. First of all, because the place was falling apart, and it was all held together with piano wire and chewing gum. And they had a kid up there who was like 17 years old. He was a college dropout. He hated classical music, but he had been there since he was like 12 as an intern, and he knew the place inside out. And they should have hired him as chief engineer, but he didn't have a college degree, and he didn't look the part. So they didn't want to hire him, so they hired me over him. And he proceeded to make my life miserable.
Oh, boy.
And I don't blame him. To this day, I don't know if I would have done the same thing. But So after I was there for about 5-6 months, I said, I don't want to do this anymore. This is ridiculous. Give the job to him. They didn't give the job to him. They hired somebody else over him. He ended up moving out, I think, to San Francisco. And I ran into him about 15 years ago at a
You talk about it?
No, it was at WBZ, which is the Channel 4 in Boston, big AM radio station, and we just sort of looked at each other and walked down the hall. But oh yeah, right, I remember you.
Yeah.
So I was doing radio, and then I left that job, but I was in Boston, and Boston was a lot easier to live in on little money than New York.
Right.
That you could live cheap in Boston at that time. You can't do it anymore. So I stayed there, and I made friends. I started working for the Boston Phoenix and writing, and I was doing a little bit of freelance producing. I would, put an ad in the paper, producer looking for bands, and I do a bunch of demos for people. And then I got this job in Trinidad, and then that didn't last, but I came back, but at least now I had more cred, so I could get, a little bit better stuff. But I was always into the electronic music thing. But, you couldn't do it. You couldn't do electronic music unless, you had tons and tons of money. And then I discovered this thing called the Alpha Centauri synthesizer, which was an Apple II-based computer music system, which had a sequencer. It had an editor. It had a waveform builder. It had all these tools. It sounded like shit, but it had all these wonderful tools for playing with the sound. And I got to know this thing, and I started developing software for it. I got a relationship with the company. Wow. This is how I met Laurie Spiegel.
Pre-MIDI.
Pre-MIDI. Yeah. Okay, this is like we're talking like 1980, 81. Right. It's how I met Laurie Spiegel, that she was really into this thing too, writing custom software for it. And, I got involved in this thing, and I started my own software company. I was developing and writing software for this system, and then this MIDI thing came out. And I said, this is it. We got it. As they say today, this is the shit. Yeah. And we finally got it. And I was working for a music store up there for a while. I was helping them set up their computer music department. Got involved in another software company that was doing MIDI sequencing for the Macintosh. It was one of the first sequencers for the Macintosh.
Who found MIDI? Who created it?
Who created MIDI? Dave Smith. Sequential circuits, and Mr. Takahashi of Roland.
Wow.
They were the two biggest influences. There were others. Right. There were people from Yamaha. Dave Cusack from Passport Designs was in on it from the very beginning.
What was Passport Designs? That name is familiar.
Passport Designs was a very successful company for about 20 years that made really good MIDI software. Out of the box, they were the first. I don't know if they were the first, but they were one of the first to do like 8-track MIDI sequencing software for Windows. Gotcha. And they had their own interface card, PC interface card. Oh, wow. Sorry, not Windows.
Mastertrax Pro? Was that?
Mastertrax Pro,
right.
That was theirs.
Passport.
And so I was working for,
I
was working for Passport too. I wrote the manuals for Mastertrax Pro.
No wonder I couldn't understand.
No wonder you didn't. It's a very funny story about, I was writing manuals for Roland. I was writing manuals for Ursa Major. For Chris Moore.
Sure.
Wow.
And when they went with AKG, I wrote a manual for the reverb. And I wrote a manual for the Roland S770 sampler. And I was at a NAMM show. And somebody said to me, "You wrote the manual for the S770. I said, "Yes, I did." They said, "Somebody I want you to meet." And it was MC Hammer's producer. And it turned out that MC Hammer was using like 16 of them on his road tour. Wow. And this guy comes up to me and said, You wrote the manual for the S770? And he gets down on the floor and kisses my hand. Oh, my God. He said, I can understand that manual. It's the first one.
So you wrote for Ursa Major? Did you do was it the space station?
I know. I joined them afterwards. I did they did a thing, I forget what it was. It was a spatial processor. It would do, stereo out of mono and stuff like that. And then they went with AKG and became, they did this thing called the ADR 68K, which was a gorgeous reverb. It was based on a 68,000 processor, if you can imagine. Yeah. Had a sampling rate of 32K. But the user interface, they were trying to go head-to-head with the Lexicon, with the 224. Right. And the user interface was gorgeous. The MIDI implementation was gorgeous. I helped them a little with the MIDI implementation. And we did the manual. And the manual would get mentioned in reviews. But, the thing just didn't take off. It didn't have the legs that the Lexicon had.
Explain what MIDI actually does for anybody who might not know it. You know what I mean? Like
musical instrument digital interface. Right. MIDI is mostly today it's a language. It's a command language for interchanging data between musical instruments and computers and consoles and any kind of electronic device that operates in real time. When it first started, there was a hardware part of it too, which is still in use. But the hardware part is not as important these days because you can now do MIDI over USB, over FireWire, over Bluetooth, over Wi-Fi, over Ethernet, pretty much over anything. And there's a new spec coming out called MIDI HD, which is also going to be transport independent. But originally, there were MIDI cables, which were these 5-pin MIDI cables. And it was very slow when it first came out because...
And there was delay, too.
No, there wasn't delay, but it would choke if you threw too much data down. It could handle about 1,000 commands a second, which sounds like a lot, except if you're running 16 channels with a lot of data, especially with things like pitch bend and aftertouch and all this stuff, it starts to choke up.
Right.
So, that was an issue pretty early in MIDI. But the whole point was they wanted to make it really inexpensive at the hardware level to implement so that manufacturers wouldn't hesitate to put it in. They said if it costs more than $10 to put in at the wholesale level, then we're not going to do it. So, at the manufacturing level. So, obviously it was this incredible success right out of the box. And it took a long time before they modified it. But in the meantime, they had all these, MIDI USB, which is now part of the spec, and all these other ways of doing it. So now it's all in the box. I mean, when you are playing a software synth within Pro Tools or within Logic, you are using MIDI.
It is speaking MIDI. Wow.
It's speaking MIDI. It's inside the box. You don't need any cables, but that's what it's doing. It's keeping the data as a MIDI file or a MIDI sequence file, and it is talking MIDI. And if you wanted to take it out and plug it into another MIDI device, you could do that.
Right.
You could take that track in Pro Tools and play a MIDI synthesizer with it if you wanted.
Do you work in Pro Tools?
Yeah.
Was that your preferred?
My primary is Digital Performer as a composer because I don't like composing in Pro Tools because I don't like the MIDI implementation in Pro Tools. It's better than it used to be, but it's still pretty far behind what Digital Performer can do. My favorite software ever was Studio Vision from Opcode.
Oh, wow.
But the company was one of the many that got bought out by and then destroyed, of which there have been many companies, and then was destroyed itself. But Opcode never made it to OS 10.
Right.
The Studio Vision never made it to OS 10. So,
then
there was nobody to update the code. So then I went over to Digital Performer, which I still use, and I like it. I'm used to it. It's like, it's what I teach my students. They say, why are we listening to Digital Performer? Why aren't we learning Logic? Why aren't we learning Fruity Loops? Why aren't we learning? It's like a religion, It's what you grow up with. If you're Presbyterian, you're going to be Presbyterian, unless there's a really good reason not to be, like you're Jewish.
Right.
But
that's a good reason not to be Presbyterian.
Good reason not to be. But once you get started, once you get used to this tool, why change if it does what you want it to do? Because really, all of them pretty much do the same thing. I mean, this one's got more synthesizers. This one's got better MIDI editing. This one's, works better with video. But the differences are really small. So
I think Europe seems to have. I've seen Cubase in Europe a lot.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, I think so. That's weird because that's really different from Pro Tools. It's a whole.
They're all different.
They're all different. I mean, they all present differently, but under the hood, they all do pretty much the same thing.
Right.
But you got to ask me about the Ballet Mecanique.
Yeah.
Ask him about the ballet. Ask me about my Ballet Mecanique.
Do you know about the Ballet Mecanique? Do you know
No.
anything about this?
No.
Okay. Well, this is, to me, this is the epitome of MIDI.
The epitome?
The epitome. Ballet Mecanique was a piece of music that was written in 1924 by an American composer in France by the name of George Antheil. And it was written for a percussion orchestra, 3 airplane propellers, 7 electric bells, a siren, and 16 synchronized player pianos. There was just one problem. You couldn't synchronize player pianos. There was no way to do it.
Right, you had a...
They'll drift. They'll drift. Right. You can start them all at the same time, but they'll drift. You've got a pneumatic mechanism on a paper roll, and they're just not going to stay together.
No. Right.
And this is an incredibly complex rhythmic piece. And once it starts to fall apart, it's never going to come back again. He thought you could do it. He thought that you could synchronize player piano. He was wrong.
Give me the instrumentation one more time.
Percussion orchestra, which is 3 xylophones and 4 bass drums and a gong, 3 airplane propellers, siren, 7 electric bells, and 16 player pianos.
And nobody cared about syncing up the propellers. So that was fun.
That was easy. Oh, and two live pianists. Two live pianists. Now, the propellers were basically fans that you stuck a wooden stick into. And it would go brrr, the baseball card in the back of your bicycle, right? The same principle. Right. So that's how they would play the airplane propellers. Right. So he couldn't do it with 16 pianos because he couldn't synchronize 16 pianos. So he ended up performing it in France with one player piano. And it was this huge hit. He was like the toast of Europe. This is the 1920s, because it was so completely outrageous. And there were riots at his concerts, which at the time was considered a sign of great artistic achievement if you had a riot at your concert. He brings it to New York. He brings it to Carnegie Hall. And for various reasons, it's a complete disaster. And the audience is laughing at him. And he goes back to Europe with his tail between his legs, and he's never heard of again. He was the hottest thing in Europe for an American composer for about 5 years, and then he completely lost it and disappeared.
Was it ever recorded?
Yes. It was actually
recorded back then, or
no? The first recording was in 1989.
Right.
At Purchase, as a matter of fact.
No kidding.
Wow.
Well, it wasn't with Purchase, but it was recorded there in a Theater C. So the piece languishes. Okay, no one's heard of it. It disappears, goes into somebody's files. He writes a different version of it in 1952, which has got no player pianos and no siren, but it's got airplane propellers. This piece I hear when I'm in high school. The percussion teacher turns me onto this piece. I'm going, there's fucking airplane propellers in this piece. I want to do this piece one of these days, right? But that's the 1952 version. Basically, it's a completely different piece. Okay.
Is it the same piano roll music?
No, there's no player piano at all.
There's no player piano.
No player pianos at all. There's 4 live pianists. And some of the theme material, some of the motif material is the same, but it's basically a completely different piece.
Right.
And that piece is performed fairly often. And when you hear about Ballet Mecanique, it's usually this 1950s version. So the 1924 version disappears. It's revived once in 1989 by a conductor named Maurice Perez, and it's performed in Carnegie Hall.
He just passed away as well.
Who just passed away.
Yes.
Yeah, Maurice was quite a character.
Yes,
Maurice.
I actually saw him. I saw him conduct something.
Yeah,
right before he died.
He was really into early 20th century American music. He did a lot with Gershwin.
He did Rhapsody in Blue.
Yeah, there you go. And he was really into Antile. He actually recreated the whole concert at Carnegie Hall that had destroyed Antile's career, and then he recorded it.
Wow.
It's
He's one of my favorite decomposers.
Boom. Thank you very much. We're here all week. So Maurice does it with a single player piano, and it's a good recording. It's really well done. Meanwhile, Schirmer, the music publisher, has taken over Antile's catalog, and there's an editor at Schirmer who was going through this stuff, and he discovers this 1924 version of the Ballet Mecanique with the 16 synchronized player pianos. And one word comes into his head, MIDI.
MIDI, wow.
And Schirmer, parent company, is music publisher, is Music Sales, which published my MIDI book. So this guy whom I had never met, but we had sort of parallel careers, this editor at Schirmer calls me up and says, do you know a piece called Ballet Mecanique? I said, yeah, it was written in 1952. He says, no, there's an earlier version of Ballet Mecanique called 1924, and it uses 16 synchronized player pianos. We have an agreement with Yamaha to supply disclaviers, which are MIDI player pianos, for if we can put together a performance. Would you like to
MIDI them all up?
MIDI them all up. Would you like to do the programming? I said, okay. It did not take me long to agree to do this project. So this was in 1998, and I did the programming, and then I sampled the bells, and I sampled the airplane propellers, which were real airplane propellers, and I sampled the siren, which was a real siren, and I was teaching at UMass Lowell at the time, and we did the world premiere performance of Ballet Mecanique in 1999 with 16 disclaviers.
Was it filmed?
Wow.
Oh, yeah.
Can we see it?
Yeah.
Really?
I actually did a documentary film, which ran on PBS, about the whole thing.
We got to check this out.
And it's streaming on Amazon. You can see the film streaming on Amazon. Yeah.
So what was the content of that the pianos were playing? Did you write it, or you transcribed?
I transcribed it.
Right.
Actually, someone else transcribed it.
But it was transcribed from the 20s
from
version?
a handwritten score.
From the 20s.
Yeah.
What he intended those pianos to play.
Exactly.
So you fulfilled what he was attempting to
fulfilled
try
his
that
dream.
he couldn't do.
That's right. And the New York Times, we did it after we did it in Lowell. They did it at Carnegie Hall. They did it at Symphony Hall. They did it at the San Francisco Symphony. Did it. It's been done 30 times.
Wow.
And you were
Since then.
able to simulate the player piano just the way that really does sound.
I mean, it's a player piano. It's a piano that
So you
plays
sample
itself.
That's right.
Right.
And we've done versions of it with like 4-player pianos because you can do it with as few as 4. We've done it with samplers. We've done it with software. I did a version of it using 4 different pianos from Ivory, 4 different software pianos from Ivory. I did it with 4 of the same pianos from Ivory, and I was getting all these phase problems because a lot of the parts are the same, between the two pianos.
Right, I was going to ask you, the 4 pianos, they cross in parts? Or
Yes,
they,
often, and they often play in unison.
So they do both. So
So
he
if you
wanted
use-
to hear, he as well as hearing the 4 pianos in harmony, he wanted to hear the sonics of 4 unison pianos.
Absolutely.
Amazing.
And he writes, the dynamics of the piece are based on how many pianos are playing at one time. That's what he wrote about the piece as he is explaining how to synchronize 16-player
Now,
pianos.
that's a fucking wacky idea.
Yeah.
Oh, he was way ahead of his time. Now, this is a guy who was friends with Hedy Lamarr, not Headley.
I know.
And the two of them, she'll sue me. She can't. She hasn't been born yet. The two of them, George Antheil and Hedy Lamarr, invented a system for cloaking torpedo guidance signals so that the
that's
Germans
right.
couldn't jam the torpedoes.
Right.
That was a big movie last year. It came out called Bombshell,
Yeah, I didn't see
which
it.
was all
didn't
about
see
that.
that. Wow,
These were these
interesting.
2 guys. And he got the idea for doing this from player pianos. Because what you do is, the way the system works is the transmitter and the receiver are in sync, and every couple of seconds they change frequency. And they do it based on a paper roll, which has punches in it.
That is so deep.
And this is now, this is spread spectrum technology. This is now everything that we know about wireless came out of this idea.
Player
Unbelievable.
piano.
And they
Headley.
Headley.
Yeah, out of Headley. So,
Who played him? Harvey Korman?
oh yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah.
yes, definitely. So that's the story of the Ballet Mecanique,
That's
and it
unbelievable.
keeps
amazing.
going. I
Can't-
actually did a robotic installation of it. I built a robotic installation with a friend of mine who does robots, and we had it.
Explain that.
The percussion parts were all played by robots.
Wow.
And we had 16-player pianos from a different manufacturer, not from Yamaha, from a company called QRS. And then all the xylophone and bass drum and gong parts were played by robots.
Are the robots like the creepy Chuck E. Cheese type
No,
brand?
they are just a bunch of automated mallets
Okay, gotcha.
that just go like this.
Yeah, gotcha.
To quote
Anyway.
Frank Zappa about the Shags, this whole thing is bringing my mind to a complete halt.
About the Shags. Yeah.
I think they were from Boston or
Hampshire.
Northampton, New Hampshire.
So anyway, that's my Ballet Mecanique story.
That's a good story.
that-
And it keeps going. Keeps going. It's there was a performance in New Zealand last year.
And so, did it occur to you that you would write a piece a la with different music, that you would like to do your own version of that?
For the concert in Lowell, I did an arrangement of a movement of a Mendelssohn symphony for 16-player pianos.
Nice.
And that was fun. The fugue from Mendelssohn's Fourth Symphony, the
But
last
did
movement.
you get actual 16 disc claviers
We did,
from Yamaha?
from Yamaha. They loaned them to us.
Yeah.
There was a guy there by the name of Mike Bates, who was the head of academic relations. He's since retired. Wonderful, wonderful man. And I called him up and I said, so I got this idea from Schirmer. They said they talked to you. We're going to do this performance on such and such a date. We'd like to get some disc claviers. And he said, how many do you want and when do you need them?
Wow, that's amazing.
And I said, I want them for a month so we can test them.
Right.
And I want 16 of them. And
Right.
God damn it, a truck came up. Actually, it was 3 trucks. And they unloaded these pianos.
It's like Eventide in the 9000s, except I don't have one.
You don't get one?
Well, we didn't get to keep them. So,
Oh, okay. All right.
Right, they brought you a truckload of none of them.
Nunya. What did I get? I got Nunya. Yeah, that's a very, very good story. Player piano.
I would love to hear what that sounds like. 16 pianos played in a room.
Let's listen to it on a break.
Well, if you go to on YouTube, you look for the National Gallery of Art, Ballet Mecanique, you can see the robotic installation. We did a film of the robotic installation, which is a shortened version of the piece. We edited the piece. And if you go to Amazon and Amazon Video Direct, and he looked for a movie called Bad Boy Made Good. That's the documentary that we got.
Bad Boy Made Good. Okay.
Well, he wrote an autobiography in the 40s, Antheil did, called Bad Boy of Music, because he was the bad boy of music. Yeah. And then he dropped dead in 1959. He reappeared at the end of his life as a film composer. And he was writing for, Cecil B. DeMille. He was writing there was a TV show called The 20th Century that Walter Cronkite helped produce. He was a composer for that. He was doing pretty well. He was pretty busy as a Hollywood film composer. And then one day he just dropped dead of a heart attack, 58 years old. That's why no one's ever heard of him.
Right. Ballet Mecanique.
Ballet Mecanique.
Ballet Mecanique.
Are you a Gene Shepard fan?
Who's Gene Shepard?
Oh, never mind.
No, go ahead. Learn me.
Your brother is a huge Gene Shepard fan. Gene Shepard was the original talk radio host, only he wasn't a host because he didn't have guests. He had a show late night on WOR here in New York, and he told stories. He was a story. You know Christmas Story, the movie?
Yeah.
Okay, that's Gene Shepard.
Oh, wow.
Oh.
That was written by him. It's narrated by him. It was a great thing he did before he died. And he did this for 25 years. He had a nightly show on WOR, and he'd tell stories of his childhood and the Army, which were, somewhat fictionalized, one assumes. But they were great. He was absolutely brilliant. He was a friend of George Antheil's.
Oh, wow.
And when we did the Ballet Mecanique, I put up on some bulletin board somewhere, it was probably on CompuServe, that I had heard that Shepard had done a memorial program to George Antheil right after he died, which was in 1959. Right. And I got a letter from a guy in Thetford, Vermont, who said he had been listening to Gene Shepard in those days, and he used to put a microphone up to his radio and record on his little reel-to-reel tape recorder, and he had that show.
Whoa.
Oh, wow.
And he copied it, and he digitized it and sent me a copy of it. So I got to hear Gene Shepard eulogize George Antheil in 1959.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it was. I think that ends up in the book too. There's a chapter called "Fidelity Isn't Always in the Specs."
Oh, nice.
And it's kind of that story.
Well, I know you start the book with that really great Frank Zappa line.
Writing about music is like dancing about architecture, which Zappa denies he said. Zappa always denied that he said that. It's like Tom Lehrer always denied that he said political satire became obsolete when Henry Kissinger won the Nobel Peace Prize.
Right.
I got to interview Lehrer a couple of times, and I mentioned that, and he said, "I never said that. I was being interviewed for the BBC, and they said, 'We remember you for that line.' And I said, 'Oh, that's nice. How does that go again?'"
Right.
And he wrote it down, but he says he never said it.
That's amazing. So fucking good.
And just back to the disclavier for a second.
Sure.
So it really kind of reads pedal moves. It does it for real.
It does it for real. And the new disclaviers actually do better than MIDI. They have double precision velocity. So MIDI has 127 gradations of velocity, but the new disclaviers have 16,000.
So when you programmed the pianos, did you play it with a pedal and it just read what you were playing, or did you program it by notes?
First of all, you step time the whole goddamn thing.
You did step time.
Because it's really complicated chords.
Right.
And I added the pedals later.
You added the pedals.
Why not?
Yeah.
Why try to do anything in close to real time?
Right.
It's all quantized. It has to be, because it goes by so fast. And it has 640 time signature changes in 1,200 bars or something like that.
Sounds like a drummer I just worked with 2 weeks ago.
Well, that's the way you did it last night. Yeah, disclaviers are wonderful instruments.
Yeah. And what's your listening pleasure these days? Do you go back to old stuff, or you try to look for new stuff, or?
I don't try to look for new stuff. My students will turn me on to stuff once in a while, and I'll listen to stuff that they recommend. Mostly, I'm a real fan of Celtic folk.
Oh, nice.
And the rock and roll that came out of that, Fairport and Silly Wizard and a little bit the Pogues.
Celtic folk. So, like starting with like Planxty, or
starting with that era. So Silly Wizard and those guys, I made friends with those guys.
Paul Brady.
Paul Brady, I love Paul Brady.
Yeah, he's a buddy.
Yeah, must be a sweet guy.
Great guy. That Andy Irvine record he did.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, it's
classic.
wonderful.
Cool.
Wonderful. Yeah, I'm a big fan of Paul Brady's song Island. Oh God.
Yeah.
First time I heard that, I said, I don't know what this song is about, but it is, I am so moved by it.
Arthur McBride.
Yeah.
Like Pontchartrain.
Yeah.
Great songs.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean that's what I listened to. Johnny Cunningham, the fiddle player, was a friend of ours. Andy Stewart was a friend of mine.
So have we left anything? Should we talk more about the book? Or no,
you were asking me what I was playing before.
Yeah, right.
So I'm taking up jazz piano again.
Right.
And the more I learn about Bill Evans,
oh boy,
the further I am from Bill Evans. But I've always played a little bit of jazz piano, and I've known, a few decent chords. But now I'm learning more alterations.
That's pretty deep stuff.
Well, yeah, getting to Bill Evans is pretty deep. It's going to be several lifetimes before I get there.
So are you learning, like, teaching yourself standards just to get around changes?
Yeah, working through standards. I'm actually working through a group. There's a studio in where I live called Morningside Studios, which puts together pro and semi-pro musicians into groups playing music that they want to play with at similar levels. So right now I'm playing in a quartet with a guitar and a bass and drums.
Oh, great.
And we're being coached by a guy from Berkeley.
Great.
And
do you teach ever at Berkeley?
No. I applied for a job there once. I didn't get it, and I was kind of happy I didn't get it. But no, I'm very happy at Tufts.
Great.
Very, very happy at Tufts. They've been very, very good to me.
Nice.
Great.
Well, I can only imagine that you're an amazing teacher.
You're very, very good to them.
We just spent an hour learning a lot of stuff.
Yeah, I want to see the
Ballet
Mecanique.
Mecanique.
Yes, Bad Boy Made Good. You should. Yeah, it's like, $3 to download or something like that. You can, and you'll be the third one. Your brother.
I've got the fourth book. So.
Right, that's right. You have the book here.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, I took it. Well, I've been.
Tony sent us
I've been skimming
both
it.
copies.
Yeah,
That's great.
yeah. No,
We leave it at the studio. I have a studio.
Yeah.
Well, that's
Everyone
where it
loves-
belongs.
that's
Yeah,
right.
It
that's
belongs
perfect.
on a coffee table.
I thought the bathroom.
If you've got a table in the bathroom. For it.
That's what I have it. I have it on my bedside, on my little dresser.
No, that's lovely.
Yeah.
Will you think you'll write another one?
If I do, it'll be about Ballet Mecanique.
Right.
Yeah, that's great.
And I've had some feelers from a couple of university presses to do something like that. I'd love to write a book called Me and the Bad Boy.
Yeah. And would you get like Kevin Kline to play him in the movie?
No. We would get Leonardo
Nice.
because he was short
Right.
and had a baby face.
Great.
So I think Leonardo would be perfect.
I like it.
And do you, for your teaching, do you change course? Like, would you teach something next year that's different than what you?
No, I tend to teach. Well, you mean within the course that I teach, do I change things? Or
No,
do I do
teach
new
different
courses?
courses?
I'm teaching these 4 courses, and I have an ensemble, and so sometimes I will not teach a course one year.
Right.
But most of the time, this is what I teach.
Right.
The most recent course is the one about the history of electronic music. That's the one that I most recently added, which I was actually teaching online for a few years before I started teaching it in the classroom. And I still teach it online during the summer. But no, I'm very happy teaching what I'm teaching.
Anything that we might have?
You tell us if there's any other good stories that you want to lay on us.
Nah.
Do we miss any jokes?
What's the difference between the drummer and a puppy? The puppy will stop whining after a couple of months. Oh, here's one of my favorites. What's the difference between a blues band and a moose?
What?
On a moose, the horns are in front and the asshole's in the back.
Perfect. What's the Vance Powell joke about the monitor engineer in the toilet?
I don't remember.
There's a difference between a monitor engineer and a toilet. A toilet only takes shit from one asshole at a time. Vance Powell, the very accomplished, famous music producer down in Nashville, started as a monitor engineer. So that was his joke.
That was his joke.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Really good.
I'll tell you that, Stewart, yours is the career that I wanted to have.
Which is what?
Producing all these great people and working with all these great people. I mean, you worked with Sean Colvin.
Yes.
And
Love Sean.
whom I adore. So, yeah, I was reading your bio, when you guys contacted me, and I said, oh, that's the guy I wanted to be.
If you change one letter in your name,
The Q?
you can get my ASCAP checks.
Oh,
my 20
nice.
cent. My 20 cent.
Your 20 cent ASCAP.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've got those from BMI. Yeah.
Kiss my ass cap.
Yeah, I
thank you.
did a bunch of library albums in the 80s
Oh, really?
when CDs were first coming out
Right.
for KPM. Mm-hmm. And that was nice. I mean, I would get, these little checks that said, for some reason, the spooky music I had made was being used by Mickey Mouse Club in Australia. I mean, I don't even know if that's true. It's like, somebody entered some number, right? And it comes, and I have checks, framed for a penny and, and 4 cents and stuff like that.
Radio royalties, like for airplay, which doesn't exist in my world. But I knew someone who worked at BMI who, the way they figured that out, like how to give you your airplay royalties, was someone would sit in a room, listen to the radio, and they would go, okay, they played ba ba ba, ba ba ba, write it down. It was completely unscientific. It was just an average of, it was like, but at that moment, one guy listened to a station. It's completely unscientific.
When I was just out of school, I would look in the New York Times classifieds for jobs, and I'd look under music.
Right.
And there was one that showed up every week. It was called a music monitor.
Is that what that is?
That's what the job was. Wow. It was for ASCAP.
Right.
And you'd take an exam, and they'd play you these really weird, versions of standard tunes, and you had to figure out what the tune was. And a friend of mine, who is now like a really incredibly successful music writer in Nashville, took the test and got like the highest score anybody had ever gotten, which was like 60%. Mm-hmm. Wow. And I don't know if they ever hired anybody out of that ed, but that was it. I mean, that was how they were doing it. ASCAP and BMI both had some guy in a room listening randomly stations and writing things down.
Exactly, and then they'd document it, and you'd get a check. But your song could be blasted on a different station if they weren't listening to it.
That's how I get my $25 every 6 months sound exchange checks. Right. Those are fantastic.
Music reports.
Sound Exchange does a good job.
Yeah, I get a $25 check every 6 months. I mean, they I don't know what it means, but
my wife is a professional storyteller, and she had a contract with Rounder Records for a while, and she did 3 CDs for them, and she didn't make any money on that. She did a little bit here and there, and for some reason, her producer let her register her stories as songs. So she actually gets BMI for these things, and and so the checks from Rounder just completely dried up after 10 years or whatever. But now she's getting $300 checks from Sound Exchange.
That's great.
Fantastic.
Well, before we break, professional storyteller. She writes the stories or she reads them?
She doesn't read them. I mean, she doesn't read them aloud.
Right.
She is a cross between an actress and a comedian.
Wow.
Okay. She's basically a monologuist, but she does stories for children. She does stories for adults. She writes a lot of her own material, especially the adult material. She wrote a story, which I did all the sound effects and music for, about when she was 16 years old and crashed the Beatles press conference in Boston.
Wow.
It's a fantastic story.
And they're usually comedic or have a...
They're comedic and dramatic.
Right.
The same part of the story, the same story, 2 years later, she's a college student, and she goes on a trip to Washington to interview Stokely Carmichael, Martin Luther King, and Walter Washington.
Wow.
And she gets appointments with all these people. And she shows up at Stokely Carmichael's office, and the office is closed because the night before King had been shot.
Oh, my
God.
And this is all true.
Amazing.
Right. So she takes those two stories and weaves them together.
Wow.
But the records she did are all for children. So they're Irish folktales and folktales from the Caribbean, folktales from the Southern states. And some of them she writes, some of them she adapts from, existing folktales. She writes the texts, herself. And they're good. I was music director on 2 of the albums.
So there's music behind it?
Oh, yeah.
Wow, great. So tell us her name and where we might be able to get it.
Her name is Sharon Kennedy. And she's got Irish stories for children, more Irish stories for children, and the second album, which is not Irish, is called The Patchwork Quilt.
Mm-hmm.
Nice.
And it's all downloadable from your favorite downloadable service because the contract was on Rounder.
Sharon Kennedy.
Sharon Kennedy.
Well,
is she from Ireland?
No, she's from Marblehead, Massachusetts.
Wow.
Nice.
But her ancestry is Irish, and we're actually planning to go to Ireland in May or June and look up where some of her people came from. But we're going back.
Is it the north or south?
The south.
Right.
She's been to Ireland many times, and she's collected stories there. But her family goes back like 6 generations.
Right. I'm just finishing kind of an amazing book. that a new book about the Troubles. Say Nothing. It's kind of amazing.
Wow.
Highly recommend that this was going on in the early 70s while we were all getting high, going to Dead concerts.
Yeah.
They were like kidnapping each other, killing each other,
bombing each other.
It was sad.
She was there in 1987, and still before the Belfast agreements.
Right.
And she crossed over from Ireland into Northern Ireland, and all of a sudden these 5 soldiers got on the bus, started pointing guns at everybody, walking up and down, and then got off the bus. And and none of the people flinched because this was something that happened every day.
Used to it. Right.
And and then since the agreements, it's been like the border between U.S. and Canada. It's nothing, right? And now it's going to get all
fucked up again.
No politics.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you.
Let's see.
Paul,
Thank you.
Thank you
Pleasure.
so much.
That was really great.
Really great.
Me and Stewie want to thank all you Gear Clubbers for listening to this crazy podcast we do. If you can, leave a review on iTunes. It really makes a difference. And don't be shy. We love hearing from you guys on the social media at Gear Club Podcast. Don't forget to go to gearclubpodcast.com for Spotify playlists, links and photos for the episodes, and my favorite hot sauce of the month.